In the spring of 1898, in a muddy boomtown wedged between the mountains and the sea at the northern end of Alaska's Inside Passage, a man named Jefferson Randolph Smith opened a telegraph office. He charged $5 to send a message anywhere in the United States. Miners fresh off the steamships lined up to wire home to their wives, their mothers, their creditors. They composed their messages, they paid their fees, they waited for replies. And replies came, almost always requesting money, which Smith was happy to wire on their behalf for an additional fee. The service was prompt, the operator professional, the equipment convincing. There was only one problem. The telegraph wire ran out the back of the building, crossed about 50 feet of open air, and connected to nothing. There was no telegraph service in Skagway. There wouldn't be one until 1901. Every message those miners sent went exactly nowhere, and every reply they received was written by the man who'd taken their money in the first place. That 50-foot wire tells you almost everything you need to know about Skagway, Alaska. It was a town where illusion and reality were nearly impossible to separate, where the line between a legitimate business and a criminal enterprise, between a civic leader and a gangster, between a boomtown and a ghost town, was never more than 50 feet long. And what makes Skagway's story so strange, so distinctly American, is that this quality never really went away. It just changed forms. But before there was a con, before there was a town, before there was even a name on a map, there was one man standing alone on a gravel flat at the head of a fjord, staring at the mountains, making a bet that nobody else would have made. Captain William Moore was 65 years old in 1887 when he first visited the Skagway Valley. He'd come with a Canadian survey party to determine the exact position of the 141st meridian, the line separating Alaska from what is now Canada's Yukon territory. Moore was a former steamboat captain who had chased gold rushes across 2 continents, from British Columbia to Peru, and he understood something about the geology of the northern ranges. He looked at the mountains ringing the Klondike region and recognized the same formations that had produced gold elsewhere. He looked at the valley below him, a narrow corridor running from a deep-water harbor on Skagway Bay up through a natural pass in the coastal range, and saw a corridor. If gold was ever found up there, and Moore was certain it would be, then every man who wanted to reach it would have to come through here. So he did something that in 1887 must have looked like madness. He filed a homestead claim for 160 acres on the shore of Skagway Bay. He and his son Ben built a cabin, a small log structure 16 by 15 feet, the first building in what would become Skagway. They built a wharf. They built a sawmill. They began clearing what would become the White Pass Trail, a route over the mountains to the interior. And they called their settlement Mooresville. Then they waited. For 10 years, William Moore and his son lived and worked on a gravel flat at the edge of the known world, improving their homestead, cutting timber, watching the seasons turn over the Lynn Canal, the longest and deepest fjord in North America, and waiting for a gold rush that had not yet happened. Think about that. A decade. That's not speculation. That's faith. In August 1896, some 500 miles to the north, a prospector named George Washington Carmack and his partners Skookum Jim and Tagish Charlie discovered gold in a tributary of the Klondike River. Word traveled slowly at first, overland to the coast, by ship to the cities. But when the steamship Portland arrived in Seattle on July 17, 1897, carrying what newspapers called a ton of gold, the news hit the American public like an electric shock. The country was crawling out of a brutal economic depression. Thousands of men, and a fair number of women, who had been unemployed, underemployed, or simply bored, looked north and saw a future. 9 days later, on July 26, 1897, the steamship Queen dropped anchor at Moore's Wharf in Skagway Bay. Hundreds of stampeders poured off the ship and onto the gravel flat. Captain Moore's decade-long bet had paid off, spectacularly and catastrophically. The stampeders did not care about William Moore's homestead claim. They did not care about Mooresville. Within days, a surveyor named Frank Reed, a figure who will matter enormously before this story is over, had replatted the settlement, laying out streets on a grid that ignored Moore's property lines entirely. The newcomers forced Moore to move his own cabin because it sat in the middle of a newly planned road. They renamed the town Skagway, an anglicization of the Tlingit word Skagwa, the place where the north wind blows. Moore, the man who'd built the wharf they'd landed on, who'd spent a decade preparing for their arrival, was pushed aside and nearly forgotten. He would eventually sue and recover about 25% of the assessed value of the land he'd lost, plus the property his improvements sat on. He stayed in Skagway until 1907, then moved to Victoria, British Columbia. He'd been right about everything, except the part where being right meant he'd get to keep what was his. By the fall of 1897, Skagway barely resembled a town. It resembled a fever. Tents and shacks lined muddy streets. A post office opened. A church went up. The Skagway News began publishing. Stampeders arriving by the thousands piled their gear on the beach and began the punishing trek over the White Pass Trail, a 45-mile route to the interior lake country where they could build boats and float 500 miles down the Yukon River to the Klondike gold fields. The Canadian Northwest Mounted Police, enforcing a rule designed to prevent starvation in the Yukon, required every person crossing the border to carry a literal ton of supplies, roughly 2,000 pounds of food, clothing, tools, and equipment. The Mounties stationed men at the summits of both passes with orders to turn back anyone who didn't have enough. That meant most stampeders had to make the trip over the pass not once, but dozens of times, ferrying loads in stages, ascending and descending the same brutal trail until everything they owned was on the other side. Those who could afford it bought pack animals. The White Pass Trail was supposed to be the easier route, longer than the competing Chilkoot Trail out of nearby Dyea, but less steep, passable by horses and mules. That turned out to be a cruel half-truth. The trail was steep enough, rocky enough, muddy enough, and icy enough to destroy animals by the thousand. Horses were unloaded from ships by being shoved off the deck into the water, literally pushed overboard, and left to swim ashore on their own. They were sold, soaking, to men who had never handled a pack animal in their lives. They were loaded with 400 pounds of gear and driven up switchbacks of broken granite in freezing rain. The trail turned into a quagmire in the fall rains of 1897. Horses slipped off cliff edges. They starved because there was no feed for them along the route. They broke their legs in rock crevices and were shot where they fell or simply left. They drowned in mud holes while their owners watched. The carcasses piled up in certain gullies, not individually, but in heaps, one atop another, in long lines visible in photographs from the era, stretching back along the trail like a grotesque inventory of ambition. Tappan Adney, a journalist covering the stampede for Harper's Magazine, wrote that he believed a horse would commit suicide and that this terrain would make them do it. Between 1897 and 1898, an estimated 3,000 pack horses and mules died on the White Pass Trail. Jack London, who passed through Skagway in 1897 on his own way to the Klondike, renamed it the Dead Horse Trail. The animals, he wrote, died like mosquitoes in the first frost, and from Skagway to Bennett they rotted in heaps. In 1929, a bronze memorial plaque was dedicated at a spot called Inspiration Point near the summit at 2,400 feet. The dead are speaking in memory of us, it reads. 3,000 pack animals that laid bones on these awful hills. That was the trail. Back in town, things were no better. By the spring of 1898, Skagway had swelled to between 8,000 and 10,000 people, making it the largest city in Alaska. An October 1897 report from the Northwest Mounted Police described it as having grown from a concourse of tents to a fair-sized town with frame buildings, stores, saloons, gambling houses, and dance halls. 80 to 100 saloons operated on its streets. The Mounted Police Superintendent, Samuel Steele, called Skagway little better than a hell on earth. And hell had a landlord. Jefferson Randolph Smith was born in 1860 in Coweta County, Georgia, into a family that had once been wealthy, his grandfather a plantation owner, his father an attorney, but had been ruined by the Civil War. The family moved to Round Rock, Texas in 1876. Smith's mother died the following year. He left home as a teenager, drifted west, and discovered that he was extraordinarily good at separating people from their money. His signature con was elegant in its simplicity. Smith would set up on a street corner with a stack of bars of soap. In full view of the crowd, he would wrap several bars in paper currency, 5s, 10s, 20s, even a $100 bill. Then he'd cover them with plain paper, mix them in with the unwrapped bars, and begin selling them at $1 apiece. A man in the crowd would buy a bar and unwrap it to reveal a 20. He'd been planted by Smith, of course. The crowd would surge forward, buying bars as fast as they could. Nobody ever found money in their soap. By the time the marks realized they'd been swindled, Smith and his shills were already gone. That swindle, repeated hundreds of times across Denver, Creede, and half a dozen other towns, earned Jefferson Randolph Smith the only name history remembers: Soapy. In Denver, Soapy had assembled a criminal organization that was part business, part political machine, part theater company. He called it the Soap Gang. He controlled gambling halls, saloons, and bunco operations across the city. He had politicians and police officers on his payroll. He ran for no office himself. He understood that real power was better exercised from behind a bar than behind a desk. When the Denver Rocky Mountain News declared war on him in 1889, he assaulted the editor. When the silver mining town of Creede boomed in 1892, he moved there and built a second empire in weeks, then abandoned it when the boom fizzled. He was, in the language of his trade, a bunco man, a professional deceiver. He'd been doing it for 20 years by the time he heard about Alaska. By the time Soapy arrived in Skagway in late 1897, he'd already built and lost criminal empires in 2 Colorado boomtowns. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, how a new settlement worked. A boomtown had no institutions, no established power structure, no functioning law enforcement. What it had was a constant flow of strangers carrying cash, passing through on their way to somewhere else. It was the perfect environment for a man whose only real talent was making the fraudulent look legitimate. Soapy set up his third empire the same way he'd built the first 2. He put the deputy U.S. Marshal, Skagway's only law enforcement officer, on his payroll. He opened a saloon called Jeff Smith's Parlor in March 1898, which became known around town as the real City Hall. He staffed it with operatives who played a variety of roles: newspaper reporters, clergymen, friendly strangers, all designed to befriend new arrivals, learn the contents of their wallets, and steer them toward rigged poker games, fraudulent shipping companies, dishonest hotels, or, naturally, the telegraph office with the 50-foot wire. What made Soapy Smith different from an ordinary thief was his understanding of the gap between appearance and reality, and his genius for occupying it. He donated money to the construction of Skagway's first church. He adopted stray dogs. He once intervened to stop a lynching. He cultivated the press, trying to present Skagway as a stable, respectable community, which, of course, made it easier to keep fleecing the people who believed him. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Soapy formed a volunteer militia called the Skagway Military Company, wrote to President William McKinley, and received official recognition. He now had a private army with federal authorization, and he used it to tighten his grip on the town. When a vigilance committee called the Committee of 101 threatened to run him out, Soapy formed his own rival organization, a Law and Order Society that claimed 317 members, more than 3 times the vigilantes' number. The Committee of 101 managed to drive out most of the petty gamblers and small-time grifters, but Smith himself was untouchable. He had the marshal, he had the militia, he had the merchants who depended on the stampeder traffic that his reputation, paradoxically, helped generate, because every newspaper article that called Skagway the wickedest town in America also told readers exactly where it was and how to get there. Meanwhile, 9 miles down the coast, Skagway's rival was dying. Dyea had sprung up at the trailhead of the Chilkoot Trail, the shorter, steeper route to the interior, and by May of 1898, it had a population of 8,000, 48 hotels, 47 restaurants, and 39 saloons. But on April 3, 1898, a massive avalanche, the Palm Sunday avalanche, buried a section of the Chilkoot Trail near Sheep Camp, killing over 65 people. The disaster made worldwide news. Prospectors began avoiding Dyea. And then, in May, construction began on a railroad out of Skagway, a railroad that would make trails obsolete entirely. Dyea never recovered. Its post office closed in 1902. By 1906, a single man was its only resident. He eventually burned most of the remaining buildings and left. Today, Dyea is a ghost town. A few pilings from its wharf still stand in the tidal flats. 9 miles away, Skagway survived. It survived because it got the railroad. The railroad is the second hinge of this story. The idea of a railroad over White Pass had been around almost as long as the gold rush itself. George Brackett, a former construction engineer on the Northern Pacific Railroad, had built a 12-mile toll road into the mountains in 1897. But a road and a railroad are different animals, and the terrain between Skagway and the summit of White Pass, nearly 3,000 feet of elevation gain in just 20 miles through granite cliffs and frozen ravines, was the kind of landscape that made engineers either famous or dead. What the railroad needed was money, expertise, and a certain amount of insanity, and those 3 things arrived simultaneously in a Skagway hotel bar. The story, as it's been told for over a century, is that 3 men met by chance one night in Skagway in the spring of 1898. Sir Thomas Tancred was a British contractor with connections to London financiers. Michael J. Heaney was an Irish-Canadian railroad contractor who'd built lines through some of the most difficult terrain in North America. E.C. Hawkins was an American engineer from Denver. They talked through the night. By dawn, the railroad was no longer a dream, but a plan. Tancred raised $10 million in British financing. Heaney would build the railroad. Hawkins would engineer it. Heaney's reported sales pitch has become part of the legend. "Give me enough dynamite and snooze, and I'll build you a railroad to hell." The White Pass and Yukon Railroad Company was organized on April 18th, 1898. It paid Brackett $110,000 for the right-of-way to his toll road. Construction began on May 28th. The first locomotive in Alaska, a second-hand 260, purchased from a narrow-gauge line in Utah, arrived in Skagway on July 21st. The railroad would be built to a 3-foot gauge with a 10-foot wide roadbed to navigate the impossibly tight curves of the White Pass Canyon. It was constructed entirely with hand tools, black powder, and regional timber. At least 35 workers died during construction. By July 29, 1900, just 27 months after the first spike was driven, the White Pass and Yukon route stretched 110 miles from Skagway to Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. It climbed nearly 3,000 feet in its first 20 miles, with grades approaching 4%. The American Society of Civil Engineers would later designate it an International Historic Civil Engineering Landmark, an honor shared with the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, and the Panama Canal. But I've gotten ahead of the story, because between the start of railroad construction in May 1898 and the driving of the Golden Spike in July 1900, something happened on Skagway's waterfront that changed the town overnight. July 4th, 1898, Independence Day. Skagway threw a parade, the town's first, and Soapy Smith rode in it on a gray horse as marshal of the 4th Division, leading his Skagway military company through the streets. When the parade ended, he climbed onto the grandstand and sat beside the territorial governor. He was, in that moment, the most powerful man in Alaska's largest city. Photographs survive from that day showing his men lounging in front of Jeff Smith's parlor on Broadway, American flags draped over the false front, the 4th of July sunshine falling on a town that looked from the outside like any prosperous frontier settlement. 3 days later, on July 7th, a miner named John Douglas Stewart walked into Skagway carrying a sack of gold he'd brought back from the Klondike, valued at somewhere between $2,700 and $2,800, or roughly $80,000 in today's money. 3 of Soapy's men befriended Stewart and lured him into a game of 3-card monte. When Stewart realized the game was rigged and refused to pay his so-called losses, the 3 men simply grabbed his gold sack and ran. This was not unusual. Soapy's gang had been robbing miners for months. But something about the Stewart robbery, the brazenness of it, the size of the haul, the fact that Stewart was a returning miner, not a gullible newcomer, ignited a fury that had been building for a long time. The Committee of 101, a vigilante organization that had been trying to drive Smith out of Skagway, demanded that he return the gold. Smith refused. He reportedly claimed that Stewart had lost it fairly. The committee called a public meeting for the evening of July 8th on the Juneau Company wharf. There was, according to multiple accounts, no hall in Skagway large enough to hold everyone who wanted to attend. The wharf was the only space big enough for the crowd's anger. 4 men were posted as guards at the approach to the wharf to keep Smith and his gang from entering. One of them was Frank Reed, the same man who had surveyed the town, who had laid out the streets, who had literally drawn the map of Skagway. At approximately 9:15 on the evening of July 8, 1898, Soapy Smith walked down to the wharf carrying a Winchester rifle slung over his shoulder. He was, by several accounts, drunk. He tried to push past the guards. Reed blocked him. Words were exchanged. Then, shots. The precise sequence has been disputed for over a century. Reed had armed himself with a Derringer and a Colt .45 revolver. Smith had his Winchester. Both men fired. But here is a detail that historians have never fully resolved. The caliber of the bullet found in Soapy's body did not match Frank Reed's pistol, and the angle of entry came from the right, not from straight ahead where Reed stood. Jesse Murphy and Cy Tanner, 2 of the other guards, were both nearby. Whether Reed actually fired the fatal shot or whether one of the other men did may never be known. What is certain is that Soapy Smith was shot through the heart and died on the planks of the Juneau wharf within minutes. His reported last words were, "My God, don't shoot." Frank Reed was shot in the leg and groin. He lingered for 12 agonizing days in a Skagway hospital before dying on July 20th. The entire reign of Soapy Smith in Skagway, from his arrival in late 1897 to the bullet that killed him, lasted roughly 9 months. His actual period of peak control, from the opening of Jeff Smith's parlor in March 1898 to his death in July, was barely 4 months. And yet those 4 months made Skagway the most infamous town in America. Smith was buried several yards outside the perimeter of the Gold Rush Cemetery, beyond the fence, in ground reserved for the undeserving. His funeral was held in the very church he had donated money to help build. The minister chose as the text for his sermon a line from Proverbs, "The way of transgressors is hard." Reed was buried with honors inside the cemetery, beneath the largest carved granite monument in the graveyard. The inscription reads, "He gave his life for the honor of Skagway." Within hours of the shootout, Soapy's gang scattered. Most fled Skagway by the first available boat. The 3 men who had robbed Stewart were arrested and jailed. Skagway, in the space of a single night, went from the wickedest town in America to a place desperately trying to prove it wasn't. And that effort, the effort to reinvent itself, is, in a way, the rest of Skagway's story. The gold rush was already winding down. By late 1898, the easiest gold in the Klondike had been claimed. The flood of stampeders slowed to a trickle. Skagway's population, which had peaked near 10,000, dropped to about 3,000 by 1900, when the town became the first incorporated city in Alaska, beating Juneau by a single day. By 1910, the census counted just 872 residents. What saved Skagway from becoming Dyea, from vanishing into the coastal forest, was the railroad. The White Pass and Yukon route continued to operate, carrying freight, fuel, and passengers to Whitehorse and servicing mines throughout the Yukon. Skagway contracted into a railroad town, its economy modest but functional, its population stabilizing at a few hundred souls who worked for the railroad, ran small businesses, and kept the lights on. The town began cleaning up, literally. As early as 1899, the Skagway Chamber of Commerce organized a cleanup day, dismantling the abandoned shacks and cabins left behind by stampeders. Businesses replaced their hastily built false fronts with more substantial buildings. The transformation was deliberate and self-conscious. Skagway didn't want to look like a boomtown anymore. It wanted to look like a place that was going to last. And the buildings it built during this quiet, often overlooked period, from about 1899 to 1920, are the ones you see on Broadway today. In early 1899, a new law required Skagway's saloons to pay a $1,500 license fee to remain open. Of the 80 saloons operating in January, only about a dozen survived to April. That single regulation did more to tame Skagway than Soapy Smith's death ever had. It turned the economics of vice from easy money to serious overhead, and most operators folded. The town kept drying out. In 1903, saloons were forced to close on Sundays, and women were barred from entry. In 1916, Skagway voted itself dry outright, 2 years before national prohibition. And on August 21st of that year, a deputy marshal named Frank Cook walked down Broadway and closed every saloon still standing. The Golden North Hotel, originally constructed in 1898 as a 2-story trading post for the Klondike Trading Company, was moved 1 block in 1908, had a 3rd story and its signature gold onion-shaped dome added, and reopened as what would become known as the oldest hotel in Alaska. It operated continuously until 2002, a century of lodging in a town that spent most of that century wondering if anyone would come. The Red Onion Saloon, which had opened in 1898 as a saloon and brothel with 10 rooms upstairs where working girls entertained clients, a system of dolls behind the bar showed which girls were available and which were occupied, survived the post-rush contraction and the morality campaigns alike. The Mascot Saloon, one of only 3 Gold Rush-era saloons in Skagway to survive all the way to local prohibition, still stands on Broadway and 3rd. Buildings moved around town. The business district itself shifted from 4th, 5th, and 6th Avenues onto Broadway, pulled by the gravity of the railroad depot. What exists on Broadway today closely resembles Broadway as it looked around 1915, a compressed, curated version of the Gold Rush town assembled from parts. Jeff Smith's Parlor, the saloon from which Soapy had run his empire, nearly disappeared. In 1922, a colorful local character named Martin Itchen bought the building, filled it with Gold Rush artifacts, and opened it as Skagway's first museum. Itchen, who operated a tour bus around the historic town, was responsible for saving the Gold Rush Cemetery from complete neglect. He was, without necessarily intending it, the first person to understand that Skagway's past was more valuable than its present. The decades that followed were lean but not lifeless. Between 1900 and 1920, Skagway's population consisted mostly of railroad employees, merchants, and a few miners who hadn't given up on the Yukon. In 1900, the railroad hired a Seattle architect to design an elegant general office building next to the depot, a deliberate signal of permanence and stability in a town that had every reason to doubt both. The railroad kept running. During World War II, the U.S. Army took over the White Pass and Yukon route, using it to supply the construction of the Alaska Highway and to move men and materiel through some of the most strategically sensitive territory in the northern Pacific. Skagway hosted military personnel who found the work, as one soldier put it, too steep for a goat and too cold for a polar bear. The Army's presence temporarily swelled the town's population and pumped federal money through its economy. But when the war ended, so did the subsidy. The military left, and the railroad returned to its peacetime work of hauling ore and passengers down to the port, where it was loaded onto ships bound for smelters in the south. In 1962, Skagway and its surrounding district were designated a National Historic Landmark. In 1976, President Gerald Ford signed the legislation creating the Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park, which encompasses 6 blocks of downtown Skagway, the Chilkoot Trail, and the White Pass Trail. 2 years later, in 1978, the Klondike Highway was completed, finally connecting Skagway by road to Canada's interior, making it one of the few inside passage communities accessible by anything other than boat or plane. The National Park Service began restoring and interpreting the town's gold rush buildings, the depot, the saloons, the Moore homestead, Jeff Smith's parlor. The NPS eventually acquired Soapy's old saloon, which was donated to them in 2007 and reopened as a museum in 2016. Then, in 1982, the thing that had saved Skagway from oblivion nearly killed it again. World metal prices collapsed. The Yukon mines that had provided the railroad's primary freight, the economic reason for its existence, shut down. The White Pass and Yukon route suspended service for the first time in over 80 years of continuous operation. Skagway, population 862 in the 2000 census, was suddenly a town without its economic engine. But the railroad had one more role to play. In 1988, a portion of the lower line was reopened, not for freight, not for ore, but for tourists. The White Pass and Yukon route became a scenic excursion train, carrying visitors 20 miles from Skagway to the White Pass summit and back, through the same granite canyons and over the same dizzying trestles that the stampeders' pack animals had died trying to cross. In 1994, the railroad was designated an International Historic Civil Engineering Landmark. In 2018, Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company, purchased the White Pass and Yukon route, along with its port and retail operations in Skagway, for $290 million. That number is worth sitting with. $290 million for a narrow-gauge railroad that was built for $10 million in 1898 money in a town of fewer than 1,000 people at the end of a fjord. The railroad that was built to move gold now moves tourists to see where the gold was moved. Today, Skagway has a year-round population of roughly 1,000 people. During summer, it doubles. Seasonal workers arrive to staff the restaurants, the tour companies, the gift shops, the train. Its economy is, by its own mayor's estimate, about 99% cruise ship industry. Over 1 million passengers disembark from cruise ships in Skagway each summer, more than 400 ships a season, as many as 5 a day, each one disgorging thousands of visitors who flood Broadway for a few afternoon hours, buy gold nugget jewelry, ride the White Pass train, take the brothel museum tour at the Red Onion Saloon, and return to their floating hotels for dinner. On the busiest days, more than 8,000 visitors walk the same streets where Soapy Smith ran his cons, roughly the same number of people who lived in Skagway at the peak of the gold rush. By evening, Broadway is empty again. The town returned to its residents. The silence so complete, you can hear the wind that gave the place its Tlingit name. Skagway is the 18th most visited cruise port in the world. Its mayor has noted that the town has to maintain the infrastructure of a city of 20,000 to support a resident population of 1,000. The math of that is a kind of ongoing miracle, or a kind of ongoing absurdity, depending on how you look at it. The town exists in its present form almost entirely because a con man made it famous and got himself killed in a way that was dramatic enough to sell tickets to for the next 128 years. There is naturally an irony in this that nobody needs to point out. But there is a deeper strangeness, too. In the Gold Rush Cemetery at the edge of town, the grave of Frank Reed, the man who gave his life for the honor of Skagway, the man with the tall granite monument and the noble inscription, receives a steady trickle of visitors. But the most visited grave in the cemetery, the one on every tour itinerary, the one people line up to photograph, is a few yards away, just outside the old fence line, in the dirt reserved for those deemed unworthy of consecrated ground. It is a simple wooden marker. It belongs to Soapy Smith. Every year on July 8th, wakes are held across the United States in Soapy's honor. His saloon is a national museum. His schemes are recounted with something close to affection by tour guides dressed in period costume. The man who terrorized Skagway is the reason Skagway still exists as anything other than a wide spot on the Alaska Marine Highway. The town tried to bury him outside the fence, and he became the attraction. Captain Moore's cabin, the 16 by 15-foot log structure that was the first building in Skagway, built in 1887 by a man who waited a decade for a future he could see and nobody else believed in, still stands. It's on 5th and Spring Street, 1 block off Broadway, maintained by the National Park Service. Most of the cruise ship passengers walking to the train depot a few blocks away probably don't notice it. It's small. It's quiet. It doesn't have a gold dome or a brothel museum or a famous grave. But it is, in its way, the truest thing in town. A man built it because he was certain something was coming. He was right. It came, and it took everything he had, and it moved on, and the cabin remained. The stampede that overwhelmed his homestead lasted barely 2 years. The con man who made the town infamous lasted 9 months. The railroad that saved it has now been running, off and on, for over a century, carrying ore, then soldiers, then tourists, each new cargo a new version of the same bet William Moore made in 1887. That people would keep coming through this valley, that the passage would keep mattering, that the wind off the Lynn Canal would keep blowing across a town that refused, against all reasonable expectation, to disappear. Broadway is quiet at 9 in the evening in Skagway. The cruise ships have pulled away from the docks. The shops are closed. The light at that latitude lingers for hours in the summer, a long northern twilight that turns the mountains the color of old pewter. If you walk down to the waterfront, past the railroad depot, past the spot where Jeff Smith's parlor stood, you reach the place where the Juneau Company wharf once extended into the harbor. The place where, on a Friday evening in July of 1898, 2 men shot each other, and one town ended and another began. The wharf is gone now. The harbor is full of cruise ship berths, concrete and steel, engineered for vessels that weigh more than every building in Skagway combined. There is no marker at the spot. There is no need for one. The whole town is the marker.